The air in the library study room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. Back in college, there was this unspoken rule among our class, a pact forged in the fire of a brutal curriculum and indifferent professors. We survived together or not at all. It wasn't about friendship, not always, it was about mutual preservation. Group projects were collective lifelines, shared notes were sacred texts, exam prep was a communal vigil, and attendance swaps were our clandestine operations against a system that seemed designed to weed out the weak. The professors didn't care who drowned as long as the syllabus was finished by semester's end. In that pressure cooker, trust wasn't optional. It was the currency of survival. That's why what he did hit us with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just another classmate, he was embedded in our machinery of survival, a cog we relied on. We thought he was one of us, until he decided to dismantle the engine for his own benefit. He was the kind of guy who mastered the art of social camouflage. He smiled just a bit too easily, a practiced, non-threatening curve of the lips. He laughed at the right moments, not too loud, never the first or the last, but always present. He was strategically helpful, volunteering to compile notes, offering to book the study room, always ensuring his name was attached to efforts that mattered, yet never sticking his neck out so far that he carried the heaviest load. He wasn't brilliant, which would have made him stand out. He wasn't lazy, which would have made him a burden. He was meticulously, deliberately average. He positioned himself at the center of every important group, a friendly ghost in every shared Google Doc, a familiar voice in every panicked late-night call. We didn't notice the pattern at first, because betrayal of this caliber doesn't arrive with a villain's fanfare. It slips in quietly, disguised as ambition, or worse, as ordinary stress. The turning point was the Integrated Systems Project, a behemoth of an assessment that counted for 30% of our final grade. It was the academic thunderdome of our semester. For weeks, our lives contracted to the glow of laptop screens in that same study room. We became a single organism, researching, writing, debugging, designing. We shared every resource, every fragile idea, every half-formed thought. The shared drive was a monument to our collective anxiety, filled with files named things like final_really_v3 and last draft_panic edition. We operated on a bedrock of assumed confidentiality. What was shared in that digital space stayed there, a sacred trust. Except for him. He had been there, of course. He contributed chapters, offered edits, brought coffee. He wore the same look of exhausted determination we all did. But while we were focused on building the project, he was focused on building his exit strategy. Without a word, without a flicker of change in his affable demeanor, he took our compiled work, hundreds of hours of collective labor, and performed a careful, surgical theft. He stripped away our names, rephrased sentences just enough to skirt the automated plagiarism detectors, restructured sections, and polished the introduction. Then, he submitted it. Early. Under his name alone. We discovered the theft in the worst way possible. On the submission deadline, bleary-eyed but with a fragile sense of accomplishment, we gathered to hit the submit button as a team. The portal blinked. An error message. Submission already received for this assignment. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Panic, quiet and immediate, flashed across everyone's faces. We refreshed. We logged out and back in. The message persisted. It's a glitch, someone said, voice thin with hope. It has to be. But the system wasn't glitching. Messages started buzzing on our phones. In a separate tab, someone pulled up the submission log. There it was. A single entry. His name. Timestamped 2 days prior. The world tilted. The air left the room. The frantic investigation that followed was a descent into a special kind of hell. Calls to him went straight to voicemail. Texts were left on read. The professor, when we finally cornered him in his office, listened with an expression of profound weariness. He sighed, not in sympathy, but in inconvenience. "Academic policy is policy," he said, steepling his fingers. "Your submission is flagged as a potential duplicate. It will have to go before the review board. Until then, the grades are frozen." He glanced at his computer. "His grade, however, has been recorded. A high distinction, I see." The fallout was a quiet devastation. It wasn't just about a grade, it was about the foundational trust that our entire survival strategy was built upon, now revealed to be rotten. The stress was corrosive. Some of us were on scholarships that demanded a certain GPA. One was an international student whose visa status was tied to academic progress. For others, it was the looming specter of explaining a failure to parents who had sacrificed everything. This wasn't a setback, it was a potential derailment. We confronted him finally, not as a mob, but as a group of shell-shocked survivors. He didn't deny it. That was the most chilling part. He stood there, in the hallway, and justified it. His eyes, usually so placid, were flat and hard. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "It's a competitive world. Every man for himself." He shrugged, a tiny, infuriating motion. "You should have been faster if you wanted the credit." No apology. No flicker of remorse. Just a smug, calculated calm that turned our fear into a pure, cold rage. He had not just stolen our work, he had stolen our sense of security and then lectured us on the rules of a game he had rigged. The institution's response was the final insult. After weeks of investigation, the professor called us in. The resolution was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cowardice. He acknowledged misconduct, but cited collective responsibility and the difficulty of untangling contributions. The punishment? He received a formal warning, a slap on the wrist that didn't even dent his stolen grade. We were awarded partial credit, a pathetic consolation prize that felt like charity. There was no justice. No real consequence. He walked out of that meeting with the same slight smile, thinking he had won. He believed the system had protected him, that his cleverness had paid off, and that we would simply absorb the loss and move on. That was his cardinal error. He mistook our silence for defeat. In the weeks that followed, he grew careless with his victory. The arrogance he'd kept carefully curated began to seep out. He bragged, not explicitly about the project, but in adjacent ways. He let slip details about elite graduate programs he'd applied to, prestigious internships he was banking on, how this strong semester was the final piece he needed to secure his future. He spoke of these things in our presence, assuming we were too cowed, too defeated, to be a threat. His arrogance became a blind spot, wide and inviting. The idea was born in the ashes of our frustration, during another late-night gathering that was less about studying and more about nursing a collective wound. The mood was dark, humor even darker. "Imagine," someone said, staring into their coffee, "if he opened his mailbox and found out his golden future had a little tarnish on it." A grim chuckle circled the room. Then another voice, quieter, more deliberate, added, "Not illegal. Not something that would actually destroy him. Just educational." The laughter died. In the heavy silence that followed, the idea ceased to be a joke. It crystallized into something else, a desire for balance. We didn't want to ruin him. We wanted him to feel the profound, gut-churning helplessness he had inflicted upon us. The panic that arrives when the future you've banked on suddenly liquefies. The desperate search for answers where there are none. We wanted him to experience a consequence, since the institution had refused to deliver one. So, we planned with a cold, focused precision that mirrored his own. This was not a haphazard prank. It was a psychological operation, crafted with the same attention to detail he had used to screw us over. We pooled our knowledge. We knew the exact graduate programs he coveted, he'd told us. We had all received official university correspondence. We studied the fonts, the layout, the specific, dry bureaucratic language, the tone of congratulation that curdles into regret. We sourced the right paper, matched the header perfectly. The letter had to be flawless, not to fool a forensic examination, but to pass the immediate, heart-stopping glance of someone who believes their dream is within reach. The letter arrived on a Monday, a day ripe with mundane hope. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like any other piece of official mail. Heavy cream paper. Crisp university logo. It began with the standard formalities: "Dear applicant, thank you for your application to the Master of Advanced Studies program." Then, the pivot. A single, devastating paragraph, couched in the passive voice of institutional power. While your academic record is commendable, a routine audit of integrity records has flagged a recent matter for review. Pending the outcome of this internal reassessment, we regret to inform you that your offer of admission is hereby placed on hold and subject to potential withdrawal. It ended with sterile politeness, inviting him to contact the office with any questions, knowing the line would be a ghost, a number we'd subtly misdirected. The effect was instantaneous and profound. We watched, from a careful distance, as the change unfolded. The confident swagger evaporated overnight. He became a ghost in the classroom, pale and distracted. His phone was a permanent appendage in his hand, his thumb constantly refreshing email. He jumped at notifications. The same guy who had preached, "every man for himself," now haunted the halls, seeking out anyone who might have a connection, a word of reassurance. He approached people with a newfound, desperate vulnerability, fishing for sympathy he had never once offered. We gave him none. Our politeness was a wall. Our smiles were masks. He was alone in his panic, just as we had been. For 72 hours, he lived inside the uncertainty we had built for him. 3 days of watching his imagined future crumble. 3 days of the cold sweat realization that his perceived invincibility was a fiction. He was forced to confront the fragility of everything he had taken for granted. On the 4th day, driven by a frenzy we had anticipated, he bypassed the letter and called the main admissions office. That's when the facade shattered. There was no flag. No review. No record of any such letter. He had been played. He didn't come to class the next day. When he finally returned, he was diminished. Not physically, but in presence. The casual arrogance that had filled space was gone, replaced by a cautious, watchful quiet. He kept his head down, his contributions in class reduced to monosyllables. He never accused us. To do so would be to admit his original sin, to drag the whole sordid history back into the light. His silence was his confession. The real revenge wasn't the letter itself, it was the transformation it triggered. After that week, a subtle but irreversible shift cemented in the ecology of our class. It wasn't a dramatic ostracism. It was something quieter and more absolute. Conversations didn't cease when he entered, they simply softened, topics shifting to the mundane. Group chats didn't boot him, they just grew silent when he spoke. Invitations to study sessions didn't need to be rescinded, they simply stopped being issued. Trust, once broken, doesn't leave with a slam of the door. It just never comes back. And he felt its absence in every interaction, a chilling vacuum where camaraderie used to be. What struck me most was the meticulousness of his new behavior. The same person who had once casually claimed ownership of shared work now asked, "Is it okay if I edit this section?" He sent follow-up emails confirming verbal agreements. He became an evangelist for transparency, a convert to the religion of documentation he had previously blasphemed. The lesson he had dismissed as weakness, the importance of trust and collective good, had finally been branded onto him, not by authority, but by fear. For the first time, he understood vulnerability. He grasped that the systems and people you rely on can vanish in an instant, leaving you exposed. We didn't celebrate. There was no triumphant toast, no shared glee. The satisfaction was a quiet, complex thing, laced with introspection. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, a thread of guilt would surface, not because he was innocent, but because we had crossed a line we'd never imagined approaching. We had stepped into the shadows to meet him. But then we would remember the hollow feeling in our stomachs when the submission failed, the acid taste of his justification, the institutional shrug that followed. And the guilt would recede, replaced by a cold understanding. This wasn't cruelty. It was symmetry. A restoration of equilibrium. The story of the letter became an unspoken legend within our circle, a ghost story we never told aloud. It existed as a dark reminder: intelligence used selfishly invites intelligence used collectively in return. We learned that revenge doesn't have to be loud or violent to be effective. It just has to be precise, a surgical strike that targets not the person's life, but their perception of themselves. He never tried anything like it again. Not in that class, not in any other. A subtle reputation preceded him, not as a prank victim, but as someone whose collaborative ethics were questionable. Professors, tipped by the vague ether of student gossip, scrutinized his work a little more closely. Opportunities for leadership or recommendation required extra proof of his character. Nothing catastrophic happened to him, and that was by design. We didn't want to ruin him. We wanted him to understand that actions echo, and that the debt of betrayal, while sometimes invisible, always comes due. By semester's end, life moved on. Grades were finalized, futures recalibrated. But that moment remained, not as a badge of honor, but as a profound lesson in agency, power, and restraint. He had taught us the anatomy of betrayal. We had taught him the physiology of consequence. That balance felt more like justice than any official ruling ever could. Looking back, I don't feel proud in a chest-thumping way. I feel resolved. We didn't become him. We didn't profit from his downfall or sabotage his career. We simply held up a mirror, a meticulously crafted, institutionally branded mirror, and forced him to sit with his own reflection for 3 days. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change a person's trajectory, just enough fear to ignite awareness, just enough uncertainty to teach humility. The ripple effects lingered long after the letter was recycled. What stayed with us most wasn't the thrill of the payback, but what we learned about ourselves. Before the betrayal, we had a naive faith in automatic fairness. We believed that if you worked hard and played by the rules, the system would protect you. That illusion was atomized the day he chose himself over the collective. The fake letter was our way of reclaiming control in a landscape where we had been rendered powerless. And once you've tasted that kind of powerlessness, you develop a permanent immunity to blind trust. He began to keep his distance, not because of any edict, but because he no longer felt secure. That was the real punishment, not public embarrassment, but private, pervasive uncertainty. Every ping of an institutional email made him flinch. Every summons to a professor's office was a potential tribunal. He lived in the same state of low-grade anxiety he had so casually imposed upon us. While we returned to a new normal, his never did. You could see it in the guarded set of his jaw, in the calculated neutrality of his expressions, in the depth of his assumption that he was untouchable. Ironically, in his attempt to weaken us, he made us stronger. Our circle tightened. We became more deliberate, more strategic. We documented every agreement, saved every email, verified every assumption. His betrayal was a harsh tutorial in self-protection, sharpening our instincts and forging bonds of loyalty tempered in fire. His shortcut to success created a group of people who would never be such easy prey again. There were moments I caught him watching us, his eyes flickering with a dawning, uneasy comprehension. It was the look of someone trying to solve a puzzle where he himself was a missing piece. He could never ask. He could never accuse. All he could do was live with the whispering possibility that he had been outmaneuvered, that the quiet people he'd stepped over had quietly stepped back. Years later, the memory isn't of the fear, but of the profound calm that settled afterwards. The moment we realized we were not merely victims to be processed by an uncaring system, but agents who could recalibrate the moral scales. Revenge is often portrayed as a consuming fire, but this was different. It was a controlled burn, precise, contained, and temporary. When it was over, we let the ashes lie. No escalation, no lingering malice, just closure. I don't know what became of him. Maybe the experience sanded down his rough edges, forced genuine growth. Maybe he just learned to be a more careful opportunist. But I am certain of one thing: he never again operated under the assumption that he could exploit others without cost. That knowledge, earned the hard way, was a lesson no syllabus could contain. In the end, the fake letter was discarded, the semester faded into transcript lines, and we all walked different paths. But the lesson remained, indelible: actions have weight. Betrayal leaves a signature in the air, a change in pressure that those who are sensitive can always feel. And sometimes, the most effective form of justice isn't about destruction at all. It's about pedagogy. It's about creating a single, flawless moment where someone is forced to stand exactly where they pushed you, to feel the ground give way beneath their own feet, and to wonder, with a heart pounding in their throat, what happens next. It's about teaching them that trust, once burned, leaves a permanent scar, and that every debt, no matter how cleverly deferred, eventually finds its collector.